Somewhere out there is a number everyone has heard, and almost nobody has actually questioned. Life expectancy in prehistory was around 30 years old. It gets repeated constantly, in documentaries, in casual conversation, in the confident tone people use for facts they've never once looked into further. And the natural conclusion people draw from it feels obvious. Nobody got old. Ancient humans lived short, brutal lives, and simply never made it far enough to experience anything resembling old age.
Do you think ancient people reach 100 years old? Tell us your opinions on the comment section.
It's easy to picture why the number sticks so effectively. 30 sounds precise, scientific, the kind of figure that shows up in a textbook next to a solemn black and white illustration of a hunched, weathered caveman who looks decades older than he actually is. It fits neatly into the broader cultural image of prehistoric life as uniformly short, violent, and grim. An image reinforced by decades of documentaries built around danger, scarcity, and constant threat. The number 30 confirms what people already expect to hear, which is exactly why almost nobody stops to ask what it actually measures. That number is true. It's also, in the way most people use it, almost completely misleading. And once you understand why, an entirely different picture of prehistoric life opens up. Averages lie when the underlying data is this lopsided, and prehistoric mortality data is about as lopsided as it gets. Infant and child mortality in prehistory was extraordinarily high, likely somewhere close to half of all children dying before reaching adulthood, from disease, injury, malnutrition, and predation. When you average a population where roughly half the individuals die before age 10 and the other half live into their 50s, 60s, or beyond, the resulting average absolutely can land somewhere around 30. But that average describes almost nobody's actual life. It's a statistical artifact of childhood mortality dragging the number down, not a description of how long a typical adult actually lived once they'd survived the most dangerous years. There's a simple way to see how badly averages can mislead in exactly this kind of situation. Imagine 10 people. 5 of them die as infants, at age 0. The other 5 live to be 60. Add up all 10 ages and divide by 10, and you get an average life expectancy of 30. Technically correct, and almost completely useless as a description of what actually happened to any individual person in that group. Nobody in that scenario died at 30. Half the group died almost immediately, and the other half lived a genuinely full length of life by any reasonable standard. Prehistoric mortality data follows roughly the same lopsided shape, just with somewhat less extreme numbers at each end. If you made it past childhood, your odds got dramatically better, and they kept improving with every additional year you survived. Skeletal analysis from multiple prehistoric populations shows that individuals who survived to adulthood had a genuinely reasonable chance of living into their 50s, 60s, and in a meaningful number of documented cases, considerably beyond that. The 30-year figure isn't wrong as a population-wide average. It's simply the wrong number to use if the question is, how long did people actually live? Because it's answering a completely different question than the one most people think it's answering. And here's where the evidence gets genuinely moving. Because it's not just about numbers on a chart. It's about what happens to a person once age or injury takes away their ability to contribute the way a healthy adult normally would, in a group entirely dependent on physical labor for survival. At a site called Shanidar Cave, in what's now Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal individual, now referred to as Shanidar I, who lived roughly 60,000 years ago. This individual had survived for years, likely a decade or more, after suffering injuries that should have been fatal on their own, including a withered, largely useless right arm, damage consistent with partial blindness, and significant hearing loss. In a world entirely dependent on hunting, tool use, and constant physical vigilance for survival, a person with those specific injuries had no realistic way to hunt, defend themselves, or fully care for their own basic needs alone. The details of these injuries, once researchers piece them together, tell a genuinely striking story. The damage to the right arm appears consistent with an amputation or severe crushing injury sustained relatively early in life, healed over with smoothed, remodeled bone that shows the injury occurred years, not days or weeks before death. The skull shows evidence consistent with a healed blow to the head, severe enough to have plausibly caused partial blindness. Advanced arthritis affected multiple joints throughout the body, the kind of degeneration that develops gradually, over a genuinely long lifespan, not something that appears suddenly in a young adult. And yet, the evidence is unambiguous. This individual lived for years after those injuries occurred, well into what would have counted as old age for a Neanderthal, based on dental wear and skeletal aging markers. That's not survival by luck alone. Injuries of that severity, sustained decades before death, only make sense if the surrounding group actively fed, protected, and cared for someone who could no longer fully provide for himself. Shanidar 1 is one of the clearest, earliest pieces of physical evidence we have that care for the vulnerable and elderly isn't a modern invention layered onto human behavior somewhere in recorded history. It appears to go back tens of thousands of years into a species that wasn't even fully our own. What makes Shanidar 1 particularly significant isn't just that one remarkable individual survived against the odds, it's that similar patterns keep showing up at other sites too, across different time periods and different regions, suggesting this wasn't a single extraordinary act of compassion, but a consistent, recurring feature of how these groups actually operated. Skeletal remains showing healed severe injuries, missing limbs, extensive tooth loss that would have made eating solid food genuinely difficult without help, and advanced age markers appear repeatedly enough in the archaeological record that researchers now treat care for the disabled and elderly as a documented, recurring behavior rather than a rare exception worth remarking on individually. This individual had survived for years after injuries that should have been fatal, and the skeletal evidence tells the specific story of how. Healed fracture lines show bones that mended properly over time, which only happens with rest and reduced physical strain, exactly the kind of accommodation a group would need to actively provide. Severe dental wear patterns typical of advanced age appear alongside these healed injuries, confirming this wasn't a young individual who happened to survive one bad accident, but someone who lived deep into whatever counted as old age for their population, carrying disabling injuries the entire time. There's a theory that explains why elderly women, in particular, appear to have lived unusually long relative to their reproductive years, a pattern that's actually quite unusual among mammals broadly. Most species remain fertile essentially until death. Human females, uniquely among long-lived mammals alongside a small handful of whale species, experience menopause and then continue living, often for decades, well past the end of their reproductive years. That fact alone is genuinely strange from a pure evolutionary standpoint, and it puzzled researchers for a long time. Evolution generally optimizes for reproduction. An individual who stops being able to reproduce, in most species, has effectively finished contributing to the next generation, and there's no obvious evolutionary pressure keeping that individual alive and healthy for decades afterward. Humans, and specifically human females, break that pattern dramatically, living an average of several decades past the point where their own bodies stop producing offspring. Something had to explain why that trait would be favored by natural selection, rather than simply fading out. Researchers call it the grandmother hypothesis, and the core idea is straightforward once you see it laid out. An older woman who stops having her own children doesn't stop contributing to her family's survival. She redirects that effort toward her grandchildren instead, gathering food, sharing childcare, and freeing up her own daughters to have more children sooner, since a grandmother's help meaningfully increases the survival odds of grandchildren who might otherwise struggle without a second experienced caregiver. Multiple studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations have found measurable increases in grandchildren's survival rates, specifically correlated with the presence and involvement of a living grandmother, exactly the kind of real-world effect you'd expect if this theory holds up. One particularly well-cited study of the Hadza found that grandmothers who actively foraged and shared food with their grandchildren had a direct, measurable effect on those grandchildren's growth and survival, especially during seasons when food was scarce and mothers were occupied caring for newborns. The effect was strong enough that researchers could statistically link grandmother involvement to improved weight gain and reduced mortality in the grandchildren, a level of quantifiable impact that's hard to dismiss as coincidence once you see the numbers laid out across multiple independent studies in different populations. If that pattern held true in deep prehistory too, and there's good reason to think it did, it would mean evolution actively selected for women who lived well beyond their own reproductive years, specifically because those extra decades of life produced more surviving grandchildren than an equivalent amount of additional childbearing would have. Long life, in other words, wasn't simply tolerated in older women, it may have been actively favored by natural selection, generation after generation, precisely because grandmothers were doing something genuinely valuable that nobody else in the group could replace. It's worth noting that the grandmother hypothesis remains an active area of research rather than settled scientific fact, and not every researcher in the field agrees on exactly how large its evolutionary effect actually was compared to other competing explanations for human longevity. But even skeptics of the strongest versions of the theory generally agree on the underlying observation that motivated it in the first place. Elderly women in hunter-gatherer societies, then and now, consistently provide substantial, measurable value to their extended families, well past the point where their own reproduction has ended, in a pattern that looks nothing like simple post-reproductive decline. Elders weren't just being tolerated once they aged past their most physically productive years either. They were doing something nobody else in the group could realistically do, something that had nothing to do with physical strength at all. They were the only living memory of events that happened decades earlier, information with no other way of being preserved or transmitted in a world without writing. Consider what that actually meant in practical terms. A severe drought might occur once every 20 or 30 years, rare enough that most adults in a group would have no direct memory of a previous one, but common enough to be genuinely catastrophic when it happened. An elder who had personally lived through the last one carried something irreplaceable, memory of which specific water sources didn't fully dry up, which plants remained edible under drought stress, which strategies had worked for their own parents' generation during the last comparable crisis. That knowledge existed nowhere else. It couldn't be looked up, written down, or reconstructed from first principles under pressure. It lived entirely inside the memory of whoever in the group happened to be old enough to have experienced it firsthand. This idea, sometimes called the library hypothesis by researchers studying the evolutionary value of longevity, treats elders as something closer to a living repository of rare but critical survival information, accumulated over an entire lifetime and available to the whole group precisely because that person survived long enough to gather it. A group with even one elder who remembered how their community survived the last major famine had a genuine, measurable advantage over a group without that accumulated knowledge, regardless of how physically capable that elder still was. Researchers testing this idea have pointed to specific historical examples where exactly this kind of rare knowledge, held by a single elderly individual, made a documented difference to an entire group's survival during an unusual crisis. Anthropological accounts describe instances where elders in traditional societies were able to identify emergency food sources during famines that younger group members had no direct knowledge of, information that had simply never come up during ordinary, non-crisis conditions and existed nowhere except in the memory of someone who had personally lived through a comparable event decades earlier. In a species without writing, that kind of rare, crisis-specific knowledge had genuinely nowhere else to live except inside the minds of the people old enough to have acquired it firsthand. This same idea helps explain tool-making knowledge too, not just crisis survival information. Complex tool traditions, passed down and refined across generations, required someone who remembered the full multi-step process well enough to teach it accurately, mistakes and all, to the next generation of toolmakers. An elder who had spent an entire lifetime practicing and refining a particular craft carried expertise that simply couldn't be replicated by someone younger, no matter how physically capable that younger person otherwise was. Skill accumulated through decades of repetition is not something you can shortcut, and elders were, almost by definition, the only members of any group who had actually put in those decades. Modern hunter-gatherer groups studied directly by researchers show the same basic pattern playing out today, offering a living window into what prehistoric elder status likely looked like in practice. Among the Hadza of Tanzania and the Juhwansi of the Kalahari, detailed demographic studies have found that a meaningful proportion of adults who survive childhood go on to live into their 60s, 70s, and occasionally beyond, numbers that align closely with what skeletal evidence suggests for deep prehistory. These same studies consistently describe elders occupying respected, socially central roles within their communities, valued specifically for accumulated knowledge, dispute mediation, and childcare support, not despite their reduced physical capacity, but essentially independent of it. Anthropologists working directly with these communities have documented elders serving as primary arbiters in social disputes, a role that requires decades of accumulated social knowledge about family histories, past agreements, and precedent, rather than physical strength or hunting skill. That same pattern, elders occupying a role built entirely around accumulated knowledge and social standing, rather than physical output, shows up across an enormous range of documented hunter-gatherer societies, different continents, different climates, different specific cultures, all converging on a remarkably similar answer to the same underlying problem. None of this means old age in prehistory was easy, or painless, or anything close to comfortable by modern standards, and it's worth being honest about that rather than romanticizing it. Skeletal remains from elderly prehistoric individuals consistently show severe arthritis, extensive tooth loss and wear, healed but poorly set fractures, and clear evidence of chronic pain that any of us would find genuinely difficult to endure without modern medicine. Getting old in prehistory meant living with real, significant physical suffering, managed with nothing beyond whatever herbal remedies, physical support, and sheer endurance the group could offer. Dental evidence alone tells a genuinely difficult story. Without any form of dentistry, tooth decay, abscesses, and eventual tooth loss were essentially inevitable outcomes of a long enough life, and skeletal remains from older individuals frequently show jaws with most or all teeth lost well before death, some with evidence of abscesses severe enough to have been genuinely life-threatening on their own. Eating solid food, an entirely ordinary daily activity for most of the population, would have required real accommodation for an elder in this condition. Softened food, help with preparation, patience during meals that likely took considerably longer than they once had. And yet, despite all of that very real hardship, the archaeological pattern across multiple sites and multiple time periods is remarkably consistent. Groups didn't abandon their elderly members once those individuals stopped being able to hunt, forage, or defend themselves at full capacity. They fed them, they protected them, they kept them close to the center of camp rather than pushing them to its edges. Whatever calculation ancient humans were making about the value of an elder's continued presence, it consistently came out in favor of care rather than abandonment, across societies separated by tens of thousands of years and enormous geographic distance. This consistency is itself worth pausing on. Across radically different environments, from the caves of the Middle East to open plains in Africa to dense European forests, spanning tens of thousands of years and multiple distinct human populations that had no contact with one another, the same basic pattern keeps appearing in the archaeological record. Care for elders wasn't a single cultural invention that happened to spread. It looks like something closer to a recurring, independently arrived-at feature of how human groups organize themselves, showing up again and again wherever researchers have the skeletal evidence to actually check. So the real image of prehistoric old age isn't absence. It's not a species that simply never lived long enough to need an answer to this question. It's presence, cared for and valued, sitting near the fire while younger members of the group brought food, asked questions, and absorbed decades of hard-won knowledge that existed nowhere else. Injured, often in genuine pain, physically diminished compared to their younger years, but very clearly still there, still valued, and very clearly not alone. Every single person encountering that 30-year statistic has, somewhere in their own ancestry, an individual who beat it, who survived childhood, survived injury, survived whatever their particular environment threw at them, and lived long enough to become exactly the kind of elder this entire story has been describing. The number 30 tells you something real about how dangerous early childhood was. It tells you almost nothing about what it actually meant for the people who made it through to grow old. It's genuinely strange, thinking about it now, that a statistic meant to describe childhood mortality somehow became shorthand in popular imagination for "nobody got old," when the actual evidence points so clearly in the opposite direction. Somewhere between a technically accurate number and the story people tell about it, An entire population of grandparents, elders, and knowledge keepers quietly disappeared from how most people picture prehistoric life, replaced by an image of universally short, brutal existence that the skeletal record simply doesn't support once you actually go looking.